The strange part isn't that the Cleveland quarterback room is crowded, it's that nothing feels settled, even though the season is technically over. On paper, the Cleveland Browns have names, contracts, and depth charts. In reality, they have uncertainty. One quarterback has a confirmed roster spot, another has the spotlight, another has the money, yet somehow none of them feel safe. Not truly. And that's the tension quietly building in Cleveland right now, a franchise frozen between commitment and collapse. Because when you strip away the press releases and coach speak, what you're left with is a team that doesn't seem to know who it's supposed to be. The front office won't fully back its coach, the coach won't fully commit to a quarterback, and the quarterbacks themselves are playing like every rep could be their last in orange and brown. That's not competition, that's survival. And once that energy creeps in, everything starts to feel temporary. What made this situation impossible to ignore wasn't a win or a loss. It wasn't a quote, it was a moment. Quiet, cold, and unsettling. A final practice under falling snow, cameras locked in, no announcement, no ceremony, just body language, just silence. And somehow it felt louder than any press conference the Browns have held all year, because players don't need to say goodbye when they already know it's coming. At the center of that moment was Shedeur Sanders. No theatrics, no emotion for the cameras, just a quarterback moving with the calm of someone closing a chapter. Every throw looked deliberate, every pause felt intentional. This wasn't a guy fighting for validation, this looked like a guy finishing business, and fans picked up on it immediately because moments like that don't happen by accident. At the same time, the organization around him looked anything but composed. Leadership questions have been stacking up quietly for weeks. Reports claim internal disagreement. Fans sense a reset coming but don't know who's staying for it. Even the most stable figures in the building suddenly feel expendable, especially Kevin Stefanski, a coach who went from safe to questioned faster than anyone expected. In the NFL, that kind of shift doesn't happen unless something deeper is breaking. And then there's the quarterback nobody is openly panicking about, which might be the most dangerous part of all. Dillon Gabriel is staying on the roster. That's confirmed, but staying doesn't mean secure. Staying doesn't mean trusted. Sometimes it just means you're next in line to be tested, or replaced, or pushed into a role nobody wants to fully commit to yet. In Cleveland, even certainty feels conditional. Hovering over everything is the contract that refuses to disappear. Deshaun Watson doesn't need to take a snap for the pressure to follow him. His presence alone shapes every conversation. The investment says franchise leader, the energy says unanswered questions, and when a team can't reconcile those two things, instability becomes the default. So no, this isn't just a quarterback battle. It's an identity crisis happening in real time. Snow on the field, silence from ownership, players playing like they're auditioning for futures that may not involve Cleveland. The Browns aren't rebuilding yet, but they're not standing still either. They're hovering on the edge of a reset they haven't officially acknowledged. And the unsettling part? The moment that confirmed all of this didn't happen on game day. It happened quietly, under falling snow, when one quarterback looked like he already knew how this chapter ends, and the franchise around him still hadn't figured out what comes next. The snow didn't feel like scenery, it felt like punctuation. On that final practice day, the kind teams usually treat as routine, the field in Cleveland turned into something heavier. Cold air, muted noise, slow movement. No music blaring, no loose energy, just snowfall stacking up as if the moment itself was being sealed in real time. And right in the middle of it stood Shedeur Sanders, moving with a focus that didn't match the calendar at all. This wasn't a quarterback gearing up for next week. It looked like someone wrapping things up. Every rep was sharp but restrained. No extra flair, no trying to impress. Just clean drops, deliberate throws, and a calm that felt almost detached. He wasn't rushing, he wasn't forcing anything. It was the kind of body language you see when a player already understands where the line is drawn, even if no one has publicly drawn it yet. What made the moment unsettling wasn't what he did, but what he didn't do. There was no visible frustration, no outward urgency, no energy spent lobbying for attention.
Sanders looked comfortable in the quiet, like someone who had already said everything that needed to be said through months of work. The snow kept falling, the reps kept coming, and somehow it all carried this strange sense of finality. Not dramatic, just definitive. The cameras picked up on it almost immediately, not because anything flashy happened, but because nothing did. That footage didn't go viral because it was cinematic, it spread because it felt honest. Fans recognized the posture instantly. This wasn't a mid-season grind, this wasn't preparation for another run. It looked like closure without a press release, a goodbye without words. And when players reach that point, they don't announce it, they let the moment speak. Sanders' movements were controlled, efficient, almost surgical. He wasn't sending a message to coaches or fans. If anything, it looked like he was sending one to himself. Finish strong, leave clean, don't drag it out. That mindset is hard to fake, especially in freezing conditions where emotion tends to spill out naturally. Around him, the environment felt different too. Teammates went through drills, coaches barked instructions, but the usual hum of competition wasn't there. The energy felt contained, cautious, like everyone understood this practice mattered for reasons nobody wanted to say out loud. In a building already dealing with uncertainty, that kind of silence hits harder than chaos. Within hours, clips from that practice were everywhere. Not analyzed for mechanics, not slowed down for footwork breakdowns, but replayed like evidence. Fans weren't asking how he threw, they were asking why it felt like this was the last time they'd see it. And once that question enters the conversation, it doesn't go away. Because in the NFL, endings rarely arrive with announcements. They arrive like this, quietly, in the cold, under falling snow. And once you've seen it, you can't unsee it. The practice footage alone raised eyebrows, but what really made people uneasy was what came after, or more accurately, what didn't come after. Shedeur Sanders didn't rush to explain anything. No clarifying statement, no emotional media moment, no effort to control the narrative. And for a player who had never shied away from confidence or presence, that sudden restraint felt intentional. Earlier in the season, Sanders' energy was unmistakable. He spoke with edge, backed himself publicly, and carried the kind of swagger that quarterbacks are almost expected to have. But now, that tone was gone. Not replaced with frustration or bitterness, replaced with calm, a quiet, clipped calm that suggested he was done answering the same questions. In every interview, the answers were clean, professional, and strangely closed off. Preparation, team focus, 1 week at a time. Nothing wrong with the words themselves. It was the absence of everything else that stood out. When reporters pressed about the future, he didn't dodge in the traditional sense. He simply didn't engage. No denial, no confirmation, just redirection. And that kind of silence tends to speak louder than speculation ever could. Players who believe they're staying usually fight for reassurance. Players who are unsure usually leak frustration. Sanders did neither. He looked like someone who had already processed the outcome privately and didn't feel the need to narrate it publicly. Analysts picked up on it quickly. They stopped quoting him and started reading his posture. Shoulders relaxed, eye contact steady, no tension in his delivery. It was the opposite of a quarterback under pressure. It looked like closure. And that shift set off alarms because it didn't align with the idea that everything was still being evaluated. It looked like evaluation had already happened, just not out loud. Fans felt it too. Social media shifted from debating his performance to dissecting his demeanor. Not, did he play well, but why does he sound done? That's when the narrative changed. The story stopped being about upside or development and started being about timing. End of season timing, exit timing, the kind you recognize only in hindsight until suddenly it's too obvious to ignore. What made the silence heavier was the chaos happening around him. The Browns were anything but quiet. Leaks, reports, vague answers from leadership, the building buzzing with uncertainty. In the middle of all that noise, Sanders' stillness didn't feel accidental, it felt strategic. Almost respectful, like he was letting the organization speak for itself. There's a certain confidence required to stay silent when everyone else is guessing your next move. Sanders wasn't trying to win the press conference. He wasn't trying to reassure the fan base. He looked like a quarterback protecting his next chapter rather than explaining his last one. And once that realization settled in, the energy around him changed completely. Because when a player stops talking about the future, it usually means he's already looking at one that doesn't include where he's standing. By the time the Bengals game arrived, the tension was already baked in. This wasn't being framed like a normal divisional matchup. It felt heavier before kickoff, like everyone involved understood this game carried weight that had nothing to do with playoff math. The cold returned, the atmosphere tightened, and once again, the focus drifted toward Shedeur Sanders, not because of hype, but because of what this moment might represent. Facing the Cincinnati Bengals is usually about measuring toughness. This time, it felt like a measuring stick for something else entirely. Final impressions, tape that lingers, moments that get replayed long after the score fades, the kind of game scouts circle quietly, while fans sense without proof that they're watching a closing act rather than a build-up. Sanders played with control, not desperation. The throws were crisp, the pocket movement was composed, but something felt deliberately restrained. There was no forcing the big moment, no reckless push to hijack the spotlight. It looked like a quarterback aware he didn't need fireworks, he needed proof. And proof doesn't always come from highlight plays. Sometimes it comes from calm execution under chaos. What added to the strange energy was the play calling. Conservative, careful, almost hesitant. Reports later suggested the staff was trying to avoid mistakes rather than chase momentum. And it showed. Drives stalled, rhythm never fully locked in. The offense felt functional but disconnected, like everyone was doing their job without truly committing to the same vision. For fans watching, it was frustrating. For Sanders, it looked like acceptance. This didn't feel like a quarterback being unleashed. It felt like a quarterback being preserved, protected, or maybe quietly phased out while the organization sorted itself behind the scenes. And that uncertainty bled into every snap. Each completion felt less like a building block and more like documentation. One more rep added to the record before the door closed. As the game wore on, the broadcast caught moments that spoke louder than the action. Sanders on the sideline, helmet in hand, eyes forward, expression unreadable. Not upset, not disengaged, just distant. The kind of look players get when their focus has already shifted beyond the immediate result. Fans noticed it instantly. That image spread almost as fast as the snow practice clips. The final whistle came and the score barely mattered. The conversation moved past who won or lost within minutes. This game wasn't remembered for a comeback or collapse. It was remembered for how it felt, like a curtain call that never officially happened. Like a player walking off knowing he'd said enough without needing to say goodbye. And as reporters started lining up questions after the game, one thing became clear. Whatever came next for Sanders, this didn't feel like the beginning of it. It felt like the end of something already decided, even if no one was ready to admit it out loud. What made the aftermath even more unsettling was how quiet everything felt at the top. Not chaotic, not defensive, just muted. And that silence followed Kevin Stefanski everywhere. A coach who once represented steadiness now stood at the center of unanswered questions, and the shift happened so subtly that most people didn't notice until it was already obvious. Not long ago, Stefanski was considered safe, the calm presence, the culture builder, the adult in the room for a franchise that had spent decades chasing stability. He wasn't flashy, but he was trusted. And in this league, trust is currency. But over the course of this season, that currency started losing value, not because of one bad decision, but because of a slow accumulation of uncertainty. Quarterback rotations that felt reactive, game plans that lacked conviction, messaging that sounded rehearsed instead of resolute. The press conferences became the clearest indicator. Same phrases, same tone, same careful language. We're evaluating everything. We'll look at the tape. We believe in our process. Those phrases are harmless on their own, but when they become the only response, they start to feel like placeholders, not answers. And in the NFL, placeholders are often what you hear right before something changes. What made it louder was ownership's absence from the conversation. No public endorsement, no strong backing, no statement shutting down speculation. In this league, silence from the top office is rarely neutral. It's read as distance. And distance, especially late in a season like this, sends a message without sending a message. Reports began to surface. Nothing explosive, just enough to shift perception. Internal disagreements, according to sources, questions about leadership structure, frustration around quarterback usage and messaging. Nothing officially confirmed, but enough dots that people started connecting them anyway. Analysts stopped debating whether Stefanski would return and started debating timelines instead.
Showed. Drives stalled, rhythm never fully locked in. The offense felt functional but disconnected, like everyone was doing their job without truly committing to the same vision. For fans watching, it was frustrating. For Sanders, it looked like acceptance. This didn't feel like a quarterback being unleashed. It felt like a quarterback being preserved, protected, or maybe quietly phased out while the organization sorted itself behind the scenes. And that uncertainty bled into every snap. Each completion felt less like a building block and more like documentation. One more rep added to the record before the door closed. As the game wore on, the broadcast caught moments that spoke louder than the action. Sanders on the sideline, helmet in hand, eyes forward, expression unreadable. Not upset, not disengaged, just distant. The kind of look players get when their focus has already shifted beyond the immediate result. Fans noticed it instantly. That image spread almost as fast as the snow practice clips. The final whistle came and the score barely mattered. The conversation moved past who won or lost within minutes. This game wasn't remembered for a comeback or collapse. It was remembered for how it felt, like a curtain call that never officially happened. Like a player walking off knowing he'd said enough without needing to say goodbye. And as reporters started lining up questions after the game, one thing became clear. Whatever came next for Sanders, this didn't feel like the beginning of it. It felt like the end of something already decided, even if no one was ready to admit it out loud. What made the aftermath even more unsettling was how quiet everything felt at the top. Not chaotic, not defensive, just muted. And that silence followed Kevin Stefanski everywhere. A coach who once represented steadiness now stood at the center of unanswered questions, and the shift happened so subtly that most people didn't notice until it was already obvious. Not long ago, Stefanski was considered safe, the calm presence, the culture builder, the adult in the room for a franchise that had spent decades chasing stability. He wasn't flashy, but he was trusted. And in this league, trust is currency. But over the course of this season, that currency started losing value. Not because of one bad decision, but because of a slow accumulation of uncertainty. Quarterback rotations that felt reactive, game plans that lacked conviction, messaging that sounded rehearsed instead of resolute. The press conferences became the clearest indicator. Same phrases, same tone, same careful language. We're evaluating everything. We'll look at the tape. We believe in our process. Those phrases are harmless on their own, but when they become the only response, they start to feel like placeholders, not answers. And in the NFL, placeholders are often what you hear right before something changes. What made it louder was ownership's absence from the conversation. No public endorsement, no strong backing, no statement shutting down speculation. In this league, silence from the top office is rarely neutral. It's read as distance. And distance, especially late in a season like this, sends a message without sending a message. Reports began to surface. Nothing explosive, just enough to shift perception. Internal disagreements, according to sources, questions about leadership structure, frustration around quarterback usage and messaging. Nothing officially confirmed, but enough dots that people started connecting them anyway. Analysts stopped debating whether Stefanski would return and started debating timelines instead. The body language didn't help. On the sidelines, he looked composed but detached, calm but hollow. Assistants were animated, players were emotional. Stefanski looked like a man standing slightly outside the moment, managing the optics more than the urgency. Coaches fighting for their jobs usually project intensity. Stefanski projected control. the kind that feels more protective than competitive. Even his defenders grew quieter, not because they suddenly stopped believing in him, but because they recognized the pattern. In this league, once the narrative shifts from performance to future viability, it's almost impossible to reverse. Stefanski wasn't just being judged on wins anymore. He was being evaluated as part of a larger reset question, and that's a dangerous place for any coach to be. By the end of the Bengals game, the contrast was impossible to ignore. A quarterback appearing ready to move on, a franchise signaling change without naming it, and a head coach whose words sounded less like plans and more like reflections. Whatever happens next, this season marked the moment Stefanski stopped feeling like the long-term answer and started feeling like the man standing closest to the exit, waiting for the decision he already sees coming. While the spotlight kept swinging between endings and potential exits, one name sat quietly in the middle of the storm. Dillon Gabriel wasn't trending. He wasn't fueling debate shows. He wasn't framed as the future or the problem. Officially, he had something the others didn't: confirmation, a spot on the roster. But in Cleveland right now, being safe on paper doesn't mean much when everything else is up for review. Gabriel's situation is deceptively uncomfortable. He isn't being chased, he isn't being protected, he's being evaluated, actively, in real time. And that's often the hardest place for a quarterback to exist, because there's no narrative shield. Every snap becomes a test, every throw gets weighed. You're not compared to your own ceiling, you're compared to everyone else's question marks. When he saw the field against the Bengals, it wasn't accidental, it wasn't garbage time either. Those snaps carried intention. The staff was watching mechanics, decision speed, presence, the kind of things that don't pop on a stat sheet, but determine whether a quarterback is viewed as a bridge or a long-term solution. Gabriel didn't light the place up, but he also didn't give anyone a reason to look away. Clean reads, solid footwork, calm pacing. That's what you want from someone under a microscope. But here's the catch. Reliability only matters when chaos is threatening to overwhelm you, and in Cleveland, chaos isn't hypothetical. With Shedeur Sanders seemingly moving on and Deshaun Watson still hovering over everything, Gabriel isn't being measured in isolation. He's being weighed as an option, a fallback, a potential stabilizer if the reset comes faster than expected. His media approach reflects that reality. Careful, professional, no bravado, no promises, just a repetition of the safest possible phrases. Earn reps, compete every day, focus on what he can control. It's quarterback speak, sure, but it's also survival language. Gabriel knows the league well enough to understand how quickly situations flip. One good stretch can change a career. One misstep can erase a season of work. What makes his position so fragile is that he doesn't control the bigger questions. He doesn't control coaching decisions. He doesn't control ownership's patience. And he definitely doesn't control contracts already signed. All he can do is stay ready, because in a room this unsettled, the next man up often stays up longer than anyone expected.
So while fans argue about bigger names and louder storylines, Gabriel's reality is simpler and harsher. He's not being asked to save the franchise. He's being asked to prove he won't sink it if the Browns are forced to pivot. And in a situation like this, that might be the most dangerous role of all. Even when he wasn't on the field, his presence never left the frame. Deshaun Watson didn't take a snap in the Bengals game, but the camera still found him, headset on, standing near the coaches, tracking every play. And with every shot, the same question lingered in the air, not whispered anymore, just unspoken. Is he still the guy? On paper, the answer should be simple. The contract says franchise cornerstone. The investment says long-term commitment. You don't move on from that easily, especially not in this league. But football decisions aren't made on paper alone. They're made in locker rooms, meeting rooms, and moments like this one, where the gap between expectation and reality becomes impossible to ignore. Watson's season hasn't been disastrous, but it hasn't been commanding either. He hasn't taken ownership of the offense in the way true franchise quarterbacks do. There were flashes, sure, but flashes aren't enough when everything around you is unstable. Leadership has to be unmistakable, and right now, the Browns don't look like a team being led by their highest-paid player. That's where the tension really lives. Reports suggest the front office isn't unified on his future. Some voices believe he deserves a fully healthy season with continuity. Others, according to league chatter, are already quietly exploring alternatives and exit paths. Nothing confirmed, nothing official, just enough smoke to make people uncomfortable. And in a building already full of uncertainty, discomfort spreads fast. The fan base feels it too. Supporters are split. Some still see the upside and argue patience. Others see a massive investment with limited return and wonder how much longer the organization can defend it. Every shot of Watson on the sideline becomes symbolic, not just of where he is, but of where the franchise might be stuck if nothing changes. What makes this situation especially volatile is timing. Younger quarterbacks are pushing, the locker room is watching closely, the coaching staff is under scrutiny. Watson doesn't exist in a vacuum anymore. His performance, presence, and perception now affect decisions far beyond the quarterback room. And if next season doesn't bring clarity, real clarity, this stops being a debate and becomes a reckoning. For now, Watson remains the shadow over everything. Too important to ignore, too expensive to move easily, too uncertain to fully build around with confidence. And until that contradiction is resolved, the Browns' instability doesn't go away, it only waits. Zooming out, the quarterback drama is only the surface layer of something much bigger. What's really happening in Cleveland is an organization stuck in a space it can't afford to occupy. Not fully rebuilding, not truly competing, just floating. The Cleveland Browns look like a franchise caught between two timelines, unsure which one to commit to, and that indecision is bleeding into everything. On the field, the signs are subtle but consistent. Units doing their jobs without synchronicity, drives that start with intent and end without conviction, play calls that feel safe instead of decisive. It's not a lack of effort, it's a lack of alignment. Everyone is moving, but not always in the same direction. That's what a team looks like when priorities aren't shared across the building.
Off the field, the energy feels just as fractured. Messaging from the top is controlled and cautious. Press conferences offer reflection instead of vision. Players speak like professionals, but rarely like believers. There's no rallying cry, no us against the world tone that usually emerges when a team is convinced it's on the right path. Instead, everything feels provisional, temporary, like decisions are being delayed rather than made. Fans sense it too, and not in an emotional way, in an exhausted one. This isn't outrage, it's fatigue. The constant wait-and-see approach has taken its toll. Supporters aren't asking for guarantees anymore, they're asking for clarity. Pick a direction, commit to it, because the middle ground is where franchises lose momentum quietly. This kind of limbo doesn't come from one bad season, it comes from uncertainty stacking up over time. Unclear leadership, shifting quarterback plans, conflicting priorities between winning now and resetting later. When all of that collides, the result isn't collapse, it's stagnation. And stagnation is harder to fix because it rarely triggers immediate change. Even inside the building, there's a sense that something is coming, but no one is saying what it is yet. Reports of internal evaluations, whispers of structural review, terms like long-term vision being used without explaining what that vision actually is. The Browns aren't just waiting on results, they're waiting on a decision, and the delay is becoming part of the problem. That's what makes this moment so defining. Not the losses, not the stats, but the feeling that the franchise is paused, standing still while everything else moves. And until Cleveland chooses whether this is a reset or a push, every snap, every press conference, every silence will continue to feel exactly the same, unresolved.